We're still going through Romans. We're on chapter 9, and Paul is, as he often does, engaging in this imaginary dialogue with his audience. And this dialogue revolves around some difficult questions that honestly we still wrestle with today, that we still sort of struggle to resolve and find answers to. And the main topic of the questions revolve around this idea of God's sovereignty. And I'll define God's sovereignty this way as it's God's absolute right to act according to his pleasure. That God, being God, has an absolute right to do what he wants according to his own pleasure. And so questions arise out of that statement. Like Romans chapter 9, verse 13 from last week. It says, "As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part?" There's the question. By no means, for he says to Moses, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion in whom I have compassion." And then today we're going to encounter this question, verse 19. "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?" There's the question about God's sovereignty. Here's Paul's answer, "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this?" And these are great, valid questions. And I completely understand that from a human perspective, it seems really unfair that God chooses to show favor to some, but judgment to others. From a human perspective, it seems unfair that God would hold us accountable if, from one belief system, God is in total control of everything and God is the one that causes everything. So how can God hold me responsible for that? And I want us to know, church, that it's very normal to ask these kind of questions. And it's really normal for us to enter times where we question God and who he is and what he's doing. The Psalms is filled with people crying out, "God, where are you?" If you read the book of Psalms, it's just filled with people asking, "When are you coming to the rescue?" Or, "Why does it seem like my enemies are winning?" Or, "God, I'm trying to be faithful to you, but I don't see you working." Or, "How come, God, I'm trying to live righteously, but it seems like the wicked are winning?" If you love me, and if I'm trying to do everything right, then why is my life a mess? Where are you, God? And it just, in a lot of ways, doesn't seem fair. And these are the same kind of questions that Paul is dealing with, and his answers are very direct. But I also want us to know that Paul is not telling us not to ask questions. He's not against sincerely asking, "God, where are you? Why am I going through this?" He's actually against a very specific group of people that ask these questions just out of a heart filled with rebellion. People that just want to find an excuse. People who just want to argue. You ever have those arguments with someone and you know they're listening to respond and not listening to understand? So Paul is basically putting a stop to people who just want God. And they're not really open to what the answers could unveil about God's character. So he's not against asking questions. These are good questions. And I want to tell us there's good answers. And if I had 5 hours to preach, we could go through these answers. And we could see what scholars say. But today I actually want to dig a little deeper about what's below this. Not just what Paul is saying directly, but what he's not saying, so that people who do have sincere hearts, people who do seek God and want to answer these from a very pure sense, would see something there. So we're going to dig beyond what Paul is saying. And that takes us to our passage in Romans chapter 9. Are we ready? Yes. Verse 16, here we go. "So, then, it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God." Actually, let's do this, because we've been doing this the past few weeks. Let's read together, shall we? Okay? I know it always feels kind of stunted and rhythmic, but we'll try. Ready? We'll start again on verse 16. Ready? Go. "So then, it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God, who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, 'For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called, not from the Jews only, also from the Gentiles. So right away, Paul uses a story from the Old Testament to make his point, and he takes us back to the story of Moses and Pharaoh. And just quick summary, in case you haven't read the story in a while, God's people are enslaved in Egypt. And it says in the Bible, he heard their cries. And in Hebrew, that word heard is this word yada, which means he knew it intimately. So it's not the picture of God up there and then, oh, new information, my children are enslaved. It's not like that. It's actually God felt from the very depths of their heart, or his heart, their pain and their suffering. So he heard their cry. He sends Moses to go tell the ruler of Egypt, Pharaoh, what? Come on, what? Let my people go, right? Pharaoh says, nope. So God sends plagues time and time again because Pharaoh keeps saying, no, I'm not going to let your people go, right? So that's the story that Paul is activating in the minds of his audience. And the narrative on the surface seems to show that what? God is blessing Moses to show his power, but he's judging Pharaoh to show his power. And what the Jewish audience would have gone to is this verse in Exodus chapter 9, verse 12, which it says, but the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. And what it seems like God did is he placed Pharaoh in a state of mind where he would disobey, even though God said, let my people go, and then God subsequently punished him for it. That seems harsh. But if we look at the wider context of what Paul is actually referring to, it'll make a little bit more sense. And I want to show us that it's actually not showing judgment as much as under the surface, Paul wants us to see God's mercy. Let's look at Exodus chapter 13. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you could have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up. That's what Paul's quoting, right? To show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. Behold, about this time tomorrow I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as has never been in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Now therefore get your livestock and all that you have in the field into safe shelter, for every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. So I want us to see that the full story of what is happening is not that God is causing someone to sin so then he can punish them. What I actually want us to see, and if you read Exodus through, is it's not just a God who punishes, but it's a God who time and time again gave Pharaoh chance after chance to humble himself. And it was met with stubbornness and disrespect. If you look at what God says in verse 15 here, it says, I could have struck down your whole people. I could have. But I didn't, because of mercy. And then in verse 19, he says, this is going to happen, but I'm warning you so you can protect yourself, right? Get all your animals and all your people to safe shelter. And what we see in Exodus is God sends a plague. Pharaoh cries for help. God hears yada, right? He hears the cry, and he relents. He backs off. But then what happens is after every plague, Pharaoh says, okay, God, I'll let your people go. What does it say? He hardened his heart. He said, just kidding. Just kidding. And then only after the sixth plague does it actually say that statement where God is the one hardening Pharaoh's heart. And this is very consistent with the way God deals with rebellion in the Bible, that the way our hearts are sending us on this trajectory. So the way that God judges us is actually just to accelerate the process and get us to where our hearts are taking us anyway. But what I want us to see in this is that God is not hardening an unhardened heart. He's just amplifying a heart that's already rebellious. And so this story, sure enough, is a story of God's judgment. We can say, oh man, God is so unfair. But I really hope that we would see it's also one full of God's patience and mercy. That time and time again, he is insulted, he is denied, his authority is questioned, he is lied to by this Pharaoh. And time again, God gives him chance after chance. How many of us would continue to give someone a chance if they broke their promise to us 9 times? But that's what we see God doing. This person back their promise, and time again, the God we serve endures that insult and shows mercy. So, in the question of God's sovereignty, I want us to think about this. The one way that God exercises his sovereignty, one way that he acts according to his pleasure, is to show mercy on those who don't deserve it. The way that God uses his free choice to act on humanity is he chooses out of his good pleasure to show mercy on those who don't deserve it. Look at verse 18 from our passage. Here's what he says. So then he has mercy on whoever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. And it's really easy, again, to look at that second part and say, God's not fair. He's making someone's heart hard. And that's valid. But let's think about what's under the surface of that first statement. Think about this. Pharaoh treated God's people. Pharaoh treated his slaves horribly. But Moses was a murderer. Think about that. Pharaoh treated God's people horribly. Pharaoh denying command. And God showed him judgment. But God showed mercy to a murderer. That's the shocking part of that statement. It's not that God judged a sinner. The shocking part of that statement is that a murderer was shown mercy by God. And so I think we need to reorient the way we sort of view this verse and this question of the fairness of God's sovereignty in this way, that nobody deserves mercy. Nobody deserves God's blessings. But yet, he acts in his sovereign will to give blessings and mercy to those who don't deserve it. He gives mercy to the murderers. He gives mercy to the liars in the Bible. He gives mercy to the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the lepers, you name it. Those people, and we're included, that don't deserve it. Those people that rebel and disobey and add to the brokenness of this world is exactly who God shows mercy to. In verse 22, it says this, right? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath? That's us. So the main narrative in the Bible, or a main narrative in the Bible, is not a God who judges people who don't deserve to be judged. The overarching narrative in that regards is a God who shows mercy to those who don't deserve it at all. And if we look at it from that paradigm, Not that God is judging and showing mercy, but that God should judge everybody, but yet he chooses to show mercy. I think it changes the way we understand what's being said. Let's look at verse 18 and 21. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? And here's the tough part for us to kind of deal with, right? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable? What is he talking about? I want us to know that this is not about God creating a sinful person so he can punish them. Okay, that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about God's right to punish sinful people. Not that he creates a sinful being and, I created a sinful being, boom, punished. It's that God has a right to deal with sinful people. But again, what's not directly said? What's not directly said? There's this picture of a potter that Paul is drawing our attention to. And his point is a potter has every right to do what he wants to do with the clay. Potter has every right. It's his clay, his choice, his sovereignty. But I want to dig at what's under there. What is this aspect, or what does this image of a potter mean to us? When a potter starts to mold the clay, that potter knows exactly what he wants to do with it. When the potter starts to work with the clay, the potter knows exactly how he wants it to look. The potter knows the perfect size, shape, function of the clay before he starts molding it. The potter knows the perfect size, shape, and function of the clay before he starts molding it. And so today, church, as we look at this passage, I want us to just be invited to ask ourselves, are we in a posture where we are going to allow the potter to mold us as he wills, knowing that he has the perfect idea of how we're to look, namely to be in the image of his son? Are we in a place where we would allow the potter to mold us? Because here's what I know, for me, and for a lot of us. We all have an ideal self that we picture in our minds, this ideal self of who we want to be. And we have this ideal self of what we want to create in us by our own efforts. We have these goals, right? We have this is what I want to be. This is who I want to become. We have this ideal self. But the problem is that when our ideal self, what we want to create, and what the potter is creating comes into conflict, you and I start to fight the potter. You and I start to fight against the potter's molding. Like, God, I want to do this, but God wants to shape me into this. No, God, I don't want anything to do with that. I'm going to resist your will. I'm going to resist your leading. I'm going to resist the care and molding that you're putting in my life. God, I want to be this. And God said, no, I want you to be this instead. Or we say, God, I want to go here. God says, I don't want you to go there. I want you to go here because here you're going to be like my son. Or sometimes God actually says, yeah, I want you to be that too. But I don't want you to do it your way because I have a better way. I agree with you. I want you to be like that. I want you to attain that. I want you to grow into that, but not your way. But no, God, I got the plan. I have this program I'm following. And you know what's the scary thing? The scary thing is if we actually arrive at where we want to be outside the molding of the potter, because when we arrive there, you and I will be so misshapen because we spent all that time fighting the one who's trying to shape us into the perfect shape and purpose. We may get there. You may attain your ideal self, but if we get there without the potter's hands working in it, we will be horribly, horribly misshapen. And we will not function as fully and thrive as much as if we followed the design of the potter. You may achieve that dream. You may get those possessions that you wanted to. You may try to create that perfect life and that picturesque, well-cultured life or whatever. You can get there. That the potter intends. See, the problem is, a lot of times when we come into conflict with God on the direction of our lives, we act as if he does not have our best interests in mind. And we react in fear of missing out on something. We act as if he doesn't know us intimately, and we act as if he doesn't love us deeply. And so we say, God, I'm going to mold myself. Can you imagine a statue trying to mold itself? Or a pot trying to mold itself? That's us. Why do we do that? Because here, we feel that if we surrender to God's sovereignty, we will lose part of ourselves. That's the truth. We feel that if we surrender to God's sovereignty, we will lose part of who we are. But here's the paradox. The paradox in Christianity is this, that it's actually when we surrender that we find our purpose. The fear is, if I give in to what God wants, I'm going to lose what I want. But the paradox in Christianity is when you actually surrender, that's when you actually find your purpose and true shape. But surrendering is hard. And surrendering is something that we typically don't want to do. But I'm always reminded that we cannot craft our lives to the level and skill that the potter can. And what I see is throughout my life, every time I'm like, God, I want to be this. And God says, no, I want you to be that. And that conflict happens more often when I submit to the potter. That's when I become who I was really meant to be. God in his sovereignty knows just how to make us. So here's what I realize. Even after talking about some of these things, there's still going to be a lot of questions that we will leave this room with about how God exercises his power and absolute ability to do anything. We should still struggle with these questions. One of my favorite verses that always forces me to kind of think about what is God doing is actually in Psalm 105, verses 12 through 17. Here's what it says. When they were few in number, so it's talking about Israel, of little account and sojourners in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, touch not my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. When he summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, he sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. So there's this song of praise, right? Psalm of praise. And you read that, it's like, that's awesome, right? God protects his people. And I read this, I want to say, whoa, hold on. Can we go back to verse 16? Look at what verse 16 says. He summoned a famine on the land. What? You're telling me that God out of his sovereign will, caused a famine? I thought it just kind of happened, and I thought he was just, leading his people as he went. But what this tells me is that God used his sovereignty to cause a famine? Whoa. Explain that to your non-Christian friends. Or send them to Pastor Alex, right? God caused a famine, but remember, I want to draw our attention to, this is a song of praise and worship. The writer of the psalm is praising God for protecting his people, but also praising God for using his sovereignty to cause a famine. Oh, why am I yelling? And so I love these passages because now we are challenged to answer the question of this. Even though this seems crazy, will we still surrender to his sovereignty? Will we still trust him? even though some of what he does doesn't always make sense. And these are questions that I wrestle with. And I sometimes love and hate an hour in community group wrestling with these questions. And did we have a conclusion? No. We're like, I don't understand, Paul. These are questions that I wrestle with, but they don't shake my faith. These are questions that I wrestle with, but these are not questions I struggle with, even when unanswered. Why? Because I know the potter. Because I've seen the potter's work in my life. I've seen the potter tell me to be this when I wanted to be this. I've seen the potter's love. I've seen the potter's goodness. That even though there are seasons where it doesn't make sense, seasons where it feels painful, seasons where I want to cry out, God, where are you? Because I know the potter. Even when it's not easy and smooth, I know that he works for my good. I know he is good and loving. So even though a lot of these questions are unanswered, it doesn't shake my faith because I know the potter. And I know that he's one who endures insults and rebellions and uses his sovereignty to show me mercy and uses his sovereignty to craft me into who I'm to be. It's not fair. God is not fair. So all these difficult questions, like I said, you can go and you can find some great, well thought out answers to why God did this or why God does that or why God doesn't do this. You can find great answers. Be my guest. I mean, we should. But you know what? It always comes down not to the answers, but to the relationship we have with the potter. Because in the end, church, it's not going to be a theology. It's going to be about a person. It's not going to be about developing a good theology. It's about a relationship with a person, the person of God who invites us to trust him, who invites us to surrender to him. And so even though there are doubts, even though there are things that don't make sense, it's not something I have to stumble over because I can trust him. Jason Van gave the analogy of how we sometimes relate or how God relates to us, and it's sort of how parents relate to their kids. And there are moments where our kids are going to ask us, why, Dad? Why do we have to do it this way? And we're going to tell them an answer that's not going to make sense to them. Or we're going to prevent them from doing something that to them seems perfectly fine. And try as we may to explain it, their tiny little minds are just not in a place where that answer is going to satisfy or make any sort of sense. Right? Why? Why do we have to do it this way, Dad? Where do babies come from? Ask your mom, right? And there's just no way we can explain to them why it is happening this way or why it has to be this way. But listen, but our kids will still trust and obey us if they have relationship. And if their relationship with us has demonstrated to them our trustworthiness as their earthly shepherds. And that's what it's going to come down to. That's what it's come down to for me, is those times where the potter has used his sovereignty to show mercy and blessing to me who don't deserve it. That's how I ended up in this island. I didn't want to leave Los Angeles. The weather's great. But the potter said, but this is where I want you. That's how I ended up being a math teacher. By the way, it's Pi Day, if anyone's wondering, right? That's how I ended up being a teacher, is I was like, God, I want to continue doing engineering. He says, no, I want you to do this. That doesn't make sense. And I fought the potter. And only when I surrendered to the potter do I now see his wisdom and his shaping. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, we read this. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Do we know the potter? Do we understand that the potter is good and is working all things for good according to his purpose? Can we close our eyes as the team comes up?